I'll try and give you a potted history. It goes back to the formation of the model anyway, in the late 1980s. And Pauline and I have had a background in various aspects of the psychotherapy field. Pauline, actually both of us in occupational therapy, going back to the 80s again. And I also had a personal mentorship from a psychotherapist in chronic acute outpatient psychiatry. That was from 1980. I was at the same time a police officer, which gave me a reality orientation that was lacking, you might say otherwise. And that was formally recorded by them. They accepted that I was doing that. It's in my staff appraisals, got copies of all of that, because some people don't seem to think that that could have happened. But all those documents are available. So I had that reality orientation as well, which I thought was important. But something that struck me at the time particularly was, given that I was a lot less experienced than I am now, obviously, because we're talking nearly 40 years ago specifically about this, is the issue of idealism versus materialism. And on the basis of an intuition, and I've got the original notes, still handwritten notes, it seemed to me that what could be both information in a Platonic sense and what could be material information was itself likely to be some kind of information. And I don't mean to collapse information into data or information processing as cognitive science understands it, but that which informs, and something that you can't lose. If something exists, whether that existence is material or it's ideal, then there has to be information there. I took that as a baseline, and I know there are potential problems with that, but that became the way that we approached everything that we did. And one of the influences and supporters of us was a Professor George Engel, who created the biopsychosocial systems model, medical model, based on general systems theory. But it impacted us because of where we were working at the time, which was a cardiac rehab unit in London, Charing Hospital, where they were very much systems-based, but they were concerned with the turbulence of the environment, as they called it, arousal states, things that were not psychological in focus, but existed at many different levels simultaneously. And our main inspiration for psychology, depth psychology and psychotherapy was Carl Jung. And we were aware that Jung did a lot of experimental work early in his career, 1902 to 1909 principally, wherein he utilized psychophysiological stress testing to detect what we call now the field of a complex. In other words, a complex being a field of information, the pools of different levels of representation that we call symptoms. And that the dissociation, which is another important factor for us, following on from Pierre Janet, who's a huge influence. He influenced William James, he influenced Carl Jung, Freud, and others. The dissociation of self-reference ego or ego consciousness that allowed things to transduce into the body, into behaviour, into environmental relationships. When you put that over Engel's stack, and when you take their symptoms and you put them in as basically the output field of an input variable, whether that's from the environment or people, but we're interested in what's the configuration of the information, you see immediately the field nature of that complex. And because we had a background in hypnosis as well, we were interested in dissociation. That goes back to Janet. And we were able then to map out how these things interacted as forms of information that could function independently. So that developed through what we use, which is infrared mass spectrometry. It's just a capnograph. It measures end-tidal carbon dioxide partial pressure. That's very close to the arterial value. This affects all the fluid mediums really, really quickly. And it became clear, and also through the work of Ernest Rossi, who was also another mentor of ours in using psychobiological hypnosis, that he, for example, recognized psychoneuroendocrine, psychoneuroimmune, neuropeptide, gene regulatory networks and the like. He was a neuroscientist, professor of neuroscience. He was also a Jungian analyst and a Freudian analyst, and he was probably the world's leading scientific hypnotherapist as well. He had all of those things going for him. But the pH was something that he didn't know about, and we've got communications with him from this 1999.
It will be.
where we explained our model of informational monism to him. We sent him all sorts of papers from various people, and we said, this is an unknown state regulator. He was interested in state-dependent memory learning and behaviour. That was his interpretation of complexes. He wasn't a field theorist. And other people in the field have noted that hyperventilation, which can be unobtrusive, can induce pH changes in the brain. That's the primary place that's affected initially. Can bring about psychotic symptoms, and people were getting diagnosed and sectioned, as we would call it in the UK. And that was as early as 1968. Allen and Agus presented a paper where this was an unknown factor. Now at Charing Cross in London, they were doing that for coronary artery spasm because it also affects the smooth muscular tubing within the body. But we were interested in the field nature of the changes. And following Rossi, the idea that what Jung was doing with a pneumograph, galvanized skin response and the like, that this could take us further. And we presented a paper in London, a brief one, of which the abstract still exists. It was published, of 500 NHS referrals that we saw across 3 different sites over the previous 3 years. And that was so important. When you had real-time traces, you could interact with someone. You could actually see defense mechanisms coming online, which would be a paradoxical rise in end-tidal partial pressure of CO2. And then it would drop and go chaotic when the subject, one level of them believed that they were no longer under scrutiny. And others said, well, there's an anxiety there about being asked about things. Yes, that's true. But you could see so many of it. I could send you some of these so you could, if ever you have the time to look, you can see just how powerful they are. So we use that a lot. And we were determined to bring biology and physiology into psychotherapy, and we were met with blanket rejection. Nobody wanted to know.
Can I just add a little bit of context?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Because we basically started off our careers and our joint careers, because we've worked together all this time, working as psychotherapists. So we've worked within the NHS, in GP, general practitioners, clinics, and also in acute and chronic psychiatry. So this is
And cardiology.
Yeah. So that was how it began. And I think you're just coming on to the fact that for the whole of that time, that certainly the way that in particular counselling, psychotherapy are regulated, they're not at all interested in biology or medicine or any of those kinds of things. And so they were just completely absent from the way that people were being assessed and diagnosed and treated and so on. So it was that was what has inspired us really to develop our model in parallel with our work as psychotherapists.
Yeah, so
And we've been doing that since.
for years. So we used the capnograph. We used the capnograph, we used dissociative methods, we used all of the traditional Jungian approaches, including creative therapies. And it was clear to us it's all about moving the representation of information around. And then we took Carl Jung's model of personality and his personality types and tried to figure out, well, how did he really come to formulate this? And I compared it with Plato. Plato's, and I'll call it intuition. I know intuition's got a bad name, but we consider that needs to be updated about what intuition actually is. But his intuition of a world of forms, given the times within which he lived and how he could have expressed that within his own culture. And when people say that it's a rational method and it's a dialectical method, that's downstream of the primary intuition, which I believe you might call ingression.
Yeah.
It came into him as a representation of something he didn't fully grasp. It settled into the level of culture at that time, and then it became split off. So there was no immanence, say, between a Platonic domain or a Platonic space and the material world. They were separated. And that's also been the issue with Aristotle as well. But anyway, to go back to Jung, he said, for example, there are 4, they're called now anyway, cognitive functions. Cognition, which for him is either rationalistic, hard concrete thinking in that abstract sense. Then there's feeling, which for him is still rational, but it has an emotional tone to it that's obviously fed by something that's not pure cognition. Then there's introverted sensing, which of course is interoception by one level of description, exteroception, and then intuition, which he defined as perception by way of the unconscious, which is different to the way that intuition is, in my view, misrepresented as being just tacit knowledge that we might just simply expect on the basis of experiences, as if there was something else that was behind this. And when we tested that, we did it first of all as a thought experiment. Okay, is this Jung's intuition? And it's settling into him, and it's taking a form, a representational form that he's comfortable with because of his experience. But what might it really be? And he went on, when he worked with Wolfgang Pauli on synchronicity and on other matters, he was extending it. He's extending the concept of intuition at that point. Speculatively, of course, in many regards. We said, okay, how about if this is real? How about if the baseline level of consciousness that we can experience subjectively appears to be intuition because it can't take any other form? Why could it not take any form? The bandwidth is immense. Not only is it pattern recognition, it's everything to do with the pattern itself. And that will potentially distribute itself into a rationalistic cognitive focus of subjectivity, an affect-toned one, internal representations, and then projections as exteroceptive representations in the environment. And the next step was to say, okay, if we're saying information is fundamental, then despite the distribution, it is all information. So we borrowed the term superpositioning and said that it's the same information superpositioned into different states, which appear as symptoms across Engel's biopsychosocial stack. And then it was, okay, how do we access this? And we thought the best way to do that is to work with these cognitive functions, but treat them not as psychoreductive, but as probably an intuition of something which is related to phylogenesis. Okay, so will that map onto the brain or into the biology of life completely? And forgive my ignorance about biology. When I say these things, I'm certainly open to correction, but it's a heuristic to say this, right? So within an individual cell, then the internal environment's important. So that's probably the basis of interoception, and everything that follows that is built upon that, so that will be conserved. Then exteroception beyond the cell membrane, the outer environment. So they're both there. And then eventually when a sophisticated nervous system evolves, you get instinct. And instinct in both its Panksepian forms, which is what Mark Solms concerns himself with, as essential drives, but also what we call meta-instincts, which is a development on from Jung again, which are representations that can become narratives, or they can be like in ethology, where you have the biogramma of the species, you have innate release mechanism, sign stimulus. For us, that's a superpositioning effect, which forms a field. And it's linked to phylogenesis and ontogenesis. So the timed release of these meta-instincts then produces behaviour emitted from the genome. But of course, we know from your work, obviously, we've learned a great deal from that. Also from our own experience, though, is that the genome is not going to be the fundamental driver, but these Platonic ingressions, we've always called that immanence, because we look for the connection, it's always there. This is a problem for us with dualism. They're trying to separate off the ontology, but at a certain point they're conjoined and they feed into one another. As we say in that video, we were also influenced by Rupert Sheldrake from a very early stage, right back to 1981. But with him, he was very rejecting of Plato. At first, he's now shifting a little, interestingly. And we know him, we've chatted with him. And we actually formulated the notion that there's no difference between Rupert Sheldrake's model and what is likely to be the Platonic ingression or superpositioning, and they do feedback and update one another, which is not something he's accepted. But it was super interesting to hear you say virtually the same thing. It was incredible, and from an independent start. But our lab is the psyche. And the means is to relate to people, to find these things. So those Meta-Qualia of Consciousness that I described before, based upon Jung's intuition about the way that the personality is structured. For us, to go on about qualia is one thing, but meta-qualia brings different associations intuitively into association to them, which again forms a field. So the colour red has an intrinsic quality due to its wavelength, obviously, but also it means things. In certain contexts, the red traffic light is one thing, the shedding of blood, but also a rose and the affect connected to that. So we have to take a wider understanding. And these meta-qualia link to the meta-instincts and therefore to Jung's archetypal theory, which itself is partially based upon Plato. And we find these in people. And if they've not been educated to know that they're there, they emerge as spontaneous narratives. And we've heard you mention that there seem to be narratives behind an awful lot of psychology that arranges things to occur. So we were interested in how does information express itself? How does it interrelate? How can we change it? How can we communicate with it? So we developed the concept of a vessel. And we said to people, we have to build the vessel so you can navigate the representations, similar to your idea of an interface. Yeah. But we also found that the structure of the vessel and how that's built determines metaphorically its shape and therefore what can ingress within into it. And then the idea of complexes, which are, I think you call them selflets, where things break off, and how complexes can interact and to disrupt that process. Because borrowing from Pierre Janet and testing this with people, once something partitions and becomes independent, and there's a reasonable process that we utilize from Janet to describe how that happens. Once that happens, the autonomy can mess up how representations form. You get compensations for that, which appear as instinctive pressure. People reject instinct, become too hyper-rational. The instinctive pressure pushes harder. The ingressions then are either cut off and made unavailable, or they too start to push, depending on what the latent potential is in a person to evolve. So I've talked an awful lot there. I'm sorry, and there's loads more, but it's basically in the video. But we're just so impressed with what you've achieved in biology and how you're bringing so much of this into the world, and the potential within that to unite different disciplines is just incredible. Oh, sorry, I haven't got you there. Oh, got you now, yeah.
Testing. Yeah. I'm always interested in the relationship of this stuff to not only the sort of psychological sciences, but the clinical work. And I get a lot of outreach from people who are the therapists or psychiatrists, or they work with trauma or that kind of stuff. So yeah, hopefully this can be helpful somehow to what you guys are doing. I mean, I think the thing with Rupert's work is that it's a small subset of what's going on. And, his fundamental hypothesis is around a kind of sensitization. Basically, he's saying that things that happen tend to happen more the more they happen, and that's great, but that's one thing. There's a million others. There's also habituation and anticipation, and the Pavlovian conditioning. There's there's a million of these things. And I think all of them are active in these very diverse media. I don't think it's all about sensitization. So I actually think it's much weirder than even he sort of sees.
I 100% agree with that. And when we find that people start to gain control over representation, so the representation changes in response to how they relate to it, then things appear behind it. And sometimes it can be very, very simple. And as you do it, you'll gain more and more competence as you talk about competencies. And just as you say, these appear to drop out of nowhere at the behavioral level. It's as if people acquire competence they didn't have because of small changes in how you interact with representations. Now, the next step is going to be pushing him into intuition. I've prepared him for that. So we'll be able to receive a higher bandwidth of associative patterns they're inclined towards homeostasis widely of the entire field of his life. And what we found is that when you do that, when you appeal to homeostasis, you get cooperation. I know it's weird, but if we have that mindset and we are open, and there are various ways of doing this where you can bring that about, then whatever is really behind it utilizes that form of relationship to the more collapsed ego. And so that's what we aim to do. We aim to establish contact with homeostasis immediately.
Yeah, very interesting. So what do you think? I'm sorry, hang on to one second.
No problem. Yeah.
So what do you think? Sort of in terms of the most actionable. What's the future of all this? Do you think that will actually be helping patients and the people you deal with? What would be helpful for all this?
Very interested in what you've been talking with respect to AI and the hybrid future. That obviously would change everything. But for us, dissociation and representation, and then language patterning. And I've been interested to watch some of the people who are into psycholinguistics that you've been speaking with. I don't, in all honesty, get the impression that they actually understand how to apply that communication at that level, because we use metaphor, we use contradictions in the structure of the language. And the thing about metaphor is it's accepted in a deep sense, even if the normal working memory aspect of consciousness hasn't a clue what you're talking about. It creates a dissociation. And provided that the metaphor is constructed in the right way, which is often agrammatical, you get a reaction from the inside which changes state that they can perceive. They can feel it. Once that's happened, other things move into alignment. And without experiencing it, it's very difficult to communicate that to people. And I understand people going on about Chomsky and transformational grammar and all the other various models, large language models and that kind of thing. But there's something about the way that the field of a human being responds relationally to how you speak, how you phrase something, that goes beyond the distribution of consciousness verbally across the cortex. And it goes deeper even than the limbic system and emotion. It goes into representations which are really only the East can give terms to. And I'm not interested in woo, although I've got a lot of experience of Eastern methods. And then we see intuition operating at two levels. We talk about subjective intuition, which is the everyday stuff. And then there's a kind of transpersonal which carries real bandwidth. And it starts to make change from the inside out. And people don't even have to know what's happening. This is what makes it quick, and it utilizes the resources that we have in different states. So we wouldn't, for example, have to worry too much about metabolism, and ATP in the brain, that kind of thing, because things are done without us having to pay conscious attention to them. And one thing that we noticed over the years before we had an explanation for this is that there was a 48-hour window when we use methods like this before change started to occur. And then someone who's a molecular biologist said that is important to do with how gene regulation works in response to changes in the environment. Now, I can't say yay or nay on that, but the observation holds true. Very often it's 48 hours before they notice a change. And then that increases. And because it's outside of consciousness, consciousness is not troubled by it. It just knows that its state has changed. The affects turn from being drive pressure. I mean, we, for example, say, and I would hold this clinically to be true, even if it's not academically true, that anxiety is not an emotion. It's a drive state which secondarily, downstream of the origin of the drive, acquires an affective interpretation and then ultimately a cognitive one. And again, what we found with people is that by the time it hits cognition, cognition cannot interpret affect. It collapses around itself so profoundly, it doesn't understand anything that is not itself. And if that collapsed cognition has become a complex, that distributes itself over the interpretation of the entire field, and the person is in a classic neurosis. They're completely split off, which is why we isolate that first. We go for that first. It's the last thing that's evolved probably in terms of a Meta-Qualia for humans. And again, when we teach, we suggest that there would have been a time in paleo-hominid evolution where, agreeing with Mark Solms on this, that affect would have been the primary way of making cognitive sense of the world. But pure cognition, as that began to come online, would have been experienced as being very unusual. And some people would have been, selected against for not being instinctive, for not being intuitive, until it reached a point where there was a shift in that. And of course, what we have now is the predominance of cognition, so the affect is treated as if it's a negative symptom. And Freud's got a lot to answer for that, because he generalized out from receiving affect states that were connected to pathology. So people became afraid of instinct. But when people aren't, and the instinct is open to carrying other things, people get well really quickly.
Yeah, even with things like intractable OCD.
Even
Yes, if we just almost ignore the cognition and we go straight for instinct, we find that through the connection to instinct, people heal, and they heal really quickly. Because obviously there's a connection to intuition and a deeper meaning about the express symptoms. But if we focus on, say, a CBT way of trying to deal with the cognition, it tends not to have any lasting effect.
No, there's a dose effect curve. There's a very sharp cliff
Yeah.
over which CBT falls. In the mid-range, the long range, it's awful. In the short term, it's as effective as basic psychodynamic counseling. There's no difference in outcome. But over the longer term, even basic psychodynamics outperform it. But because of its emphasis on hyper-rationality, that appeals to people who control mental health. Unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, it's considered cost effective, isn't it? It's your revolving door where, you do what you can to patch people up and send them back out again. But it has no real deep or lasting effect on their stability, on the homeostasis. And so they're just, they're back in a few months later, going through the same processes again.
Yeah.
Whereas this seems to, if we go for instinct and we work with instinct, and we do on a regular basis, we can turn people around really quickly, maybe in a few sessions.
Yeah. It's just supposed to be impossible.
Yeah.
But we consider affect to be the carrier wave of instinct. So the anxiety, which is pure drive, it carries forward a compensatory response which cognition cannot understand. Because when cognition collapses, it can not understand anything but itself. And once it collapses around that singularity, that's it. They're cut off from their instincts. Their metabolism will start to change in response to how things download and transduce. So it's no longer just psychological. You get the symbolic conversion reactions and disorders. And it looks like a hell of a mess. So then there's a biochemical intervention and then a hyper-rational intervention on top of that. And people are still estranged from themselves and can't communicate. So there's a lot more. It'll be in the video. If you don't mind, Mike, I'll send you that again.
Yeah, please do. Yeah. No, that's cool. That's a lot to think about. Yeah. Yeah. Send the video, and I'll see if I have any more thoughts on it. I mean, you guys are, as you know, you're far beyond what I know, in this area, right? So I don't know how much useful.
Oh, you're very, but you've been incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
Because we felt quite isolated, that no one else in the world was near what we've, and I don't mean near as in height, but near as in space and time.
Yeah.
And I now find myself using your terms because of what we call dialectical syncretism.
Yes.
Sorry, which is basically a normal syncretism, which unfortunately is the blending of inharmonious elements. Like dual aspect monism, that's a contradiction in terms, in our view. But what you could do with dialectical syncretism is say, what is the same and what is different between these two? How do we collide them together to understand where we can be informed by differences, or where we have the same language underneath the surface structure differences? So when I think in a dialectical syncretic way, I find a lot of your terminology more useful than the ones that I use. And I thought, well, why not? they're equivalent terms, and we would always acknowledge where those terms, when we use them, come from, because that's the right thing to do. And very often it gives us a better angle. So you've been incredibly influential, Oz.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we see, what you talk about empirically in our clinical work every day, don't we? We experience it happening, and it's probably the first time, we've known someone like yourself to talk in a way that we directly experience through our clinical work. You put a language to it, as Steve said. We have our own, but there's so much overlap.
Yeah.
In terms of what we're seeing.
Yeah.
That it's quite incredible, and I think the fact that before we became familiar with your work, it was a case of, if we share this with anyone, it will seem like woo-woo.
Yeah.
But because obviously you're a scientist, and you're doing incredible things in a research sense to help people. I mean, that's, for us, that's so inspirational.
This is it's huge.
Incredibly inspirational. And to some extent, and I know that this might sound as I'm going off on a limb a little bit, but even the way that you present your ideas to do with things like cancer, the way that cancer as a disease evolves, it's allowed us through our work to give people a completely different perspective of the mechanisms involved, and it allows them to have agency over what's happening to them.
Yeah.
And to understand it as not just as a disease process, but in other ways as well. And we actually have a colleague who has been going through something with her husband as she's been working with us, and your perspective, I know, has helped her as well, and helped her family.
Yeah, he's a cancer sufferer.
Yes, yeah.
You're affecting people's lives, so it probably doesn't get back to you. Well, maybe it does. I might be making a huge assumption there, but we know lots of people who have been given hope.
Yes, they have.
And adjusted their perspective on the predicament because of your influence.
That's remarkable. Thank you for telling me that. I don't know. I mean, I have people emailing me all the time with various, disorders, everything from birth defects on up to, relationship issues, which I don't have anything to say about. And I would like to get to a point where we can actually help people. So it sounds like you guys are doing that. That's great.
Well, as we say, Mike, it's been such an inspiration. I mean, our own daughter has a genetic condition, and that idea of Platonic ingression, and of being receptive to it in such a way that it increases somebody's competencies in certain areas. It's moving, but we've seen that with her. One element of that is that she has difficulty with her speech, both receptive and expressive speech, and we've noticed over time, particularly if she's unwell, she has a high temperature. I mean, I couldn't possibly explain the mechanism, but what we have noticed is a correlation between that and actually a change or an advance in her speech and her ability to communicate, which is just incredible.
That's amazing. I've read about this. I've read about the article that I read was about very young children who were autistic and didn't speak, and they would have fevers. And during the fever, they would talk during the fever.
Absolutely, that's what we've witnessed as well.
Yeah, so there is work on this. I don't know if they figured out, how it works or anything like that. I didn't pursue it, but this is a thing. I've read about this before.
Yes,
That's amazing.
it is fascinating, and your idea of there being a Platonic space, and the idea of information ingressing from the Platonic space and instantiating in people in human lives. I'd have to say that we see that, we've seen it, we see it, we continue to see it. It's quite incredible.
Well, we had our own way of saying it,
Yeah.
but you've augmented that in such a way that, Well, if it's again, it's very, very moving because we see the effects of that on real people.
Amazing. Well, I appreciate that very much. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all your work. Anybody that's actually out there helping people, I know how hard that is, and you're able to make a difference. So that's amazing. Thank you. I truly appreciate it. All right. Send the video and be in touch if anything that we're doing is helpful. I'm very happy to know that.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so
Continue
much.
to watch your work with interest.
Oh, indeed. Thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Lovely to meet you.
Take care.